Greetings and welcome to this talk on understanding and changing harmful religion. Religion and the word God are often used to justify wars, oppression, and exploitation. Today, many in the Western world, as well in other parts of the world, are leaving organized religion because they're no longer accepting the moral hypocrisy of talking of a God of love, peace, or morality, when in the name of this very God, a lot of harm is perpetrated. Leaders say that they are acting in the name of God often. When they do so, they claim to protect people. Most of the time, they're doing this in the name of high moral ideals. But what they're frequently really doing is to give their own ideas and actions an absolute stamp of approval by using God language. What they're in effect doing is confusing themselves with God, playing God. We currently see this in the debate in the United States, where a former leader is almost worshipped like a god or a savior. And a lot of people identify with this, and there's violence being threatened to protect this leader. Typically, leaders get away with this because followers are identifying with that leader in a godlike position. One of the most glaring examples in history is, of course, Nazi Germany. And in my book, which is the basis for this talk and the next three other talks that I will be giving, A Violent God Image, which really is an analysis of a violent God image and an attempt to overcome a violent God image, I start with the example of Nazi Germany because there Christianity was used to justify the most horrendous evils in the world. One of the most famous salutes that was used during those time, which is a salute that is now forbidden in Germany and in other countries to even say or to make, is the so-called Heil Hitler. And I'll put that in quotation marks here, where the word Heil actually is the German word for salvation. And while it was similar to Hail Caesar, wishing well to the leader, Hitler was basically identified with the German nation by Germans. And so the idea was that he was bringing salvation to Germany, to the nation. He was basically deified. He was put in the position of a god who would save this nation that felt that it had been decimated or had been shamed. And that is one of the reasons why in Germany, the word salvation, even to this day, has a weird ring to it. Heil is a very strange word when one uses it in German. And I originally come from Germany, so I know about that. But of course, this godlike adoration didn't just start with Hitler. I already mentioned Hail Caesar was something that was common to say about the emperors of Rome. It was used to basically profess this. The soldiers were professing that they were willing to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of the Caesar. Suetonius writes about this in the Lives of Caesars. The idea of sacrifice for a leader or for a nation is something that is very common in many nations, but it has particular valence in so-called Christian nations. We know that in states that, like in the United States, when a president gives a speech, the president often makes references to God and that God bless the United States of America, or in Britain, God bless the Queen, the use of God is basically done to justify the absolute power of the leader. So there's a deification. And many people actually think that there's some idolatry going on here. Of course, then in the Middle Ages, the popes played God. The popes were the ones that would coronate the emperors. There was fighting going on who had the real say. And all of this is typically done in fairly violent ways. This claim to absolute power, this identification of a leader and of the people following, typically justifies also that that leader then can do wars and expand and try to reach for imperial control across the world. In recent times, we have a very unique example where US President George W. Bush claimed to do God's will. He actually explicitly did this. He once said, quote, "I trust God speaks through me. Without that, I couldn't do my job." He said that to a group of Amish folks in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In fact, Bush had also justified the war against Iraq by saying that God told him to do so. In the book American Theocracy, Kevin Phillips gives us a lot of examples of how the United States political system and the leaders of the United States justified their own colonial imperial conquests, as well as the suppression of certain groups inside the United States in the name of God. And to this day, the United States justifies bombing freedom and democracy into other countries all over the world in the name of the notion that God wants the United States to bring freedom and liberty and democracy to the entire world. This is very much rooted in the ideals of the United States, of the founding of the United States, which partly, of course, is connected to separating itself from a tyrannical monarchy as it was perceived externally, but then on some level, the leaders, by trying to free others, inadvertently often have oppressed others. Now, this word inadvertently is one that we will come back to as we're analyzing and trying to understand harmful religion, because these political examples that I have just given, and the examples also by church authorities that have power, are often done, or frequently, or one could even say typically are done in the name of noble moral efforts. We're currently in a time where the war in the Ukraine is being waged. And there are many different perspectives. The Ukrainians are basically a play ball between superpowers. And one could think of it as a chess game of these superpowers. And they're using the Ukraine as a pawn in their attempt for world domination, for who has the most power, and related to that, who gets the resources of this very resource-rich country and the influence in the world. And again, both sides are justifying their interventions by references to high moral or religious standards. It's also known that clergy often play God in many religions. And one of the examples is the child sexual abuse scandal that has happened in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in some other churches. The Southern Baptist Convention has been in the news about that. Again, an abuse of power in the name of God, which in many respects rests on people trying to be like God or like the God that they are projecting. That word projection is something that we'll also come back to. In my work as a psychoanalyst and as a mental health counselor, I have come across so many people who have felt that their psyches, even their spirit, have been mutilated by people using God for controlling them, for telling them that they shouldn't trust themselves, that they are only loved or accepted if they follow the rules of this organization, if they basically learn by heart certain things that they didn't necessarily agree with, and if they accepted that God is a moral watchdog that does what these authorities want them to do. For many, God has functioned as a deadening voice. For others, however, and this is the counterpart now, especially for those who have been oppressed in one way or another, God has often been the very voice that would save them from being reduced to the oppressor, that would give them a standing against the annihilating voices of the oppressor, that would be stronger than all the forces out there that appear like God. God would be seen as the one who can take on the gods, as Merle Jordan, a professor at Boston University, once said, former professor. So the word God can be used in all these abusive, oppressive ways, but it also can be a very powerful word, and the belief in God can be very powerful to help people free themselves from the idolatry of those who oppress them. Now, what the lecture here today will focus on is the understanding, trying to understand how religion, how God talk, how, as I call it, God images first become violent. And by violent, I don't mean necessarily just violent outside, but how they come to do violence to us, because the most pernicious way in which religion is used to harm people is by basically hollowing people out, by getting people to internalize a view of themselves that's absolutely bad, that is terrible, that has no value, and so on. So how does that happen? We could think that, well, maybe children are impressionable, but it's much more complicated because people hold on to this even when they're not children anymore. In fact, many people believe that harmful religion is the right religion. So, and harmful religion, as I said, is used to justify wars, to justify harm, outside harm in many respects. So that's what I want to go into. Now, I am presenting here something that I didn't come up with first myself, but that someone else, a internationally known psychotherapist, peace activist, and theologian, or one might say a spiritual writer, because the word even theologian has this kind of stale ring to it, or just like an academic, very distant kind of person. That's not what he is. He is a very wise person. His name is Eugen Drewermann, or Eugen Drewermann. And here you see a picture of him. Drewermann is someone who was silenced at the behest of Pope Benedict XVI before he became Pope in the early 90s, when Benedict XVI was basically the moral watchdog and the doctrinal watchdog in the Vatican. He was silencing all kinds of other theologians. And in 1986, when Drewermann became popular in Germany with first fairy tale interpretations that people experience as healing, and then applying this healing method of interpretation to gospel stories, and he became a best-selling author, then he got on the radar of Ratzinger, and Ratzinger wrote to Drewermann's archbishop that Drewermann's writings had caused deep worry in the Vatican. It had caused deep worry because Drewermann questioned that the church has the monopoly on interpreting scripture, on interpreting religious texts. And Drewermann argued instead that people from within are able to understand these stories. You don't need a priest to understand a biblical story. You can understand it by listening to your own dreams, by listening to the language in your own psyche, by understanding the language in your own psyche of symbolism, and that way one could understand it. And so that threatened the influence and the power of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, basically. And so Ratzinger, in that letter in May 1986, instructed the Archbishop to take the appropriate measures against Drewermann. Now, because Drewermann was very popular, it took 5 years of a very public debate that was all over the news, that was on national television. I was in seminary in Germany at the time, and I moved here in 1992 to the United States. But it was like soccer games that were on primetime television, the debates. He had a debate with a bishop, famous bishop, Casper, who then later became a famous cardinal in the Vatican. And with many others, he was constantly on television. And what was so refreshing is he did not speak in stale ways about religious texts. He talked about religious texts like the writer of the Prophet, Khalil Gibran, speaks about religion. And he opened religion in a poetic manner. Now, before Drewermann did all of this, and Drewermann is spelled Drew, like D-R-E-W, and then E-R-M-A-N-N, and his first name is Eugen. It's like Eugene without an E. Before he did that, he had studied theology. He had studied biblical studies. He had studied psychoanalysis, and he'd studied philosophy. And he tried to understand what he called the structures of evil. He tried to understand, how does evil come about? And that was a 3-volume work that led to him getting his doctoral degree. And here are those 3 volumes. I'm going to take the first one here. It is basically an analysis of the first 12 chapters of the Bible, whether in the Hebrew Bible or in the Christian scriptures, particularly of one strand of the writings in there, because in the analysis of these texts, one has found that these texts were not just all written by one writer, but they were written by numerous sources and then put together. And so the one writer that used the word Yahweh for God is called the Yahwist. And one can identify which verses primarily come from this writer by that writer using the word Yahweh for God. The other writers used Elohim or El for God primarily. And also there were some other differences. But Drewermann looked at especially those texts, and he found something fascinating. This writer is the one who wrote the so-called story of paradise in Genesis 2, and then of the so-called, in the Christian tradition, it's called the so-called fall story. In Judaism, this is not called the fall story, but we'll stay here with what Christianity made out of it, because that was very influential. This is the story that's at the heart of what Christianity called the doctrine of original sin. And folks, this doctrine of original sin is at the heart of so much evil that has been perpetrated in the world. Christianity justified racism, it justified misogyny, it justified colonialism with that story. It basically argued that women are guilty of bringing sin into the world by Eve eating the apple, all kinds of things like that, and many other ways in which the story and the doctrine of original sin was used to control people. So what Drewermann does is he argues that Christianity, or that Christian doctrine, got the meaning of the story completely wrong, that it misunderstood that story in a terrible way, namely by portraying the story as if this was about a battle of wills between humans wanting one thing and God wanting another. Instead, Drewermann points out that this story is actually from Genesis 2, the paradise story, to Genesis 3, showing us how a God image that was originally enlivening, that was not against human, that was walking with them in the garden, that gave everything to them in the garden, that spoke with them, that was intimate with them, turns into a God image that becomes controlling, that becomes heteronymous, that becomes an adversary, that becomes somebody who judges them. And so, because this story has had such a tremendous impact in the world, to this day, if you look in doctrinal books of all the churches, there's still talk about the fall. There's still talk about how humans basically fell from God because they wanted to be proud and they wanted to assert themselves against God. They wanted to be disobedient and they were sinful, and sin is understood in that way. So the word sin has been used as a cudgel basically to hit people over the head. And today, many people are just leaving churches, leaving Christian traditions because they don't need this moral talking down to them anymore. That is one of the reasons, this moralistic talking in churches, that people say, you know, I don't need this anymore. And so in the United States, one calls people who leave churches the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S. But this is really in many Western countries. People are leaving institutional religion, partly because they're feeling it's hypocritical, but also because they're saying we don't need the church or we don't need religion to be good moral beings. So this reduction of religion and of God to morality has, again, inadvertently led to people turning their back on religion. Now, the surveys that are done usually find that this doesn't mean that people are not believing in God anymore, that they're not spiritual anymore, but they're just leaving this moralistic, controlling language and these ideas behind. So one of the other reasons, and then I'm going to go into the story, why Drewermann became so popular, he published a book in 1989 that analyzed clergy mentality. And what he found, this is a very big tome. It's called Clergy. This is my copy here. It's heavily used. Clergy, Psychogram of an Ideal, or you could say like a psychological analysis of the clergy ideal in the Roman Catholic Church. And I have a chapter in my book, chapter 4, that kind of summarizes the argument in the book Clergy. And this analysis, by the way, has been picked up in studies on child sexual abuse. And there was a big study in Australia that argued that Drewermann's suggestion for a therapy of the system of the church so that it doesn't produce the kind of clergy mentality that leads to abuse, those suggestions have to be implemented in the Roman Catholic Church. That would be something that Pope Francis hopefully could do. Pope Benedict XVI did not do that. But when that came out in 1989, it became an instant bestseller in Germany, and it also became a bestseller when it came out in 1993 in French edition as #1 on the bestseller list of Le Monde, and it bumped the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the new one that had just come out, from first spot. So Drewermann has been a very popular author and also speaker in Germany. There is a YouTube channel with many of his talks, some of them in English, including a talk where he, together with the Dalai Lama, had a conference in Zurich at the ETH. And Drewermann talks about freedom and fear and anxiety, and then has a discussion with the Dalai Lama. That talk and that conversation can be found online on a channel called Drewermann Kanal, K-A-N-A-L. But let us go into Drewermann's reinterpretation of Genesis 2 and 3, because with that reinterpretation, he points the way to use this text as understanding the human condition rather than judging the human condition. That is, in his view, also the role of religion. He shows how a persecuting and ambivalent God image is a secondary development after actually a sense of goodness about the world, of being absolutely wanted. And the primary reason for this is not wanting to be self-sufficient, all of this, but the emergence of fear. So let us go into this story. In my book, I set this somewhat up with a look at Adolf Eichmann. There's a famous book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And one of the big questions that the judges had for Eichmann, who was the one who organized the transports of Jews to concentration camps, was, did Eichmann have a conscience? And what came out in the trial of Eichmann is that he tried first to change something, to not have the transports go to the concentration camps. But then when he got flagged from the authorities, he, in a quote, actually says that the popes had spoken, meaning the authorities had spoken, and that he felt like he couldn't really do anything. He had to just obey orders. He liquidated his own free will in submission to these godlike figures of the Führer, of the Nazi officials. So, and he did that because he was afraid. Now, Drewermann talks about what kind of fear does it take to liquidate oneself and to basically go to outside authorities and to want one's absolute recognition, as if they decide over who one is or not. So in this Structures of Evil trilogy, Drewermann basically gives us tools to understand the difference between healthy and unhealthy religion. It's a study of how religion turns unhealthy and feeds a spiral of fear and violence. And when we are dominated by fear, one of the most significant things that Drewermann points out is that moral appeals go unheard in that feeling. When a nation sinks into the cauldron of its collective fear without being anchored somehow in the bonds of a healthy form of spirituality, deep in the layers of the unconscious, and not through referring to like doctrines and to leaders, then people are susceptible to projecting images from inside onto leaders and to follow them in godlike fashion. That is what I would say is happening right now in what is called the MAGA movement, where Donald Trump is basically deified and turned into a god. And that has to do because people do not feel inside anchored. Now, hopefully this will not lead to a dictatorship. There are many other counter forces in the United States. But I'm giving this talk right now after President Biden yesterday thought it necessary to go to Philadelphia, to Independence Hall, and to talk about how he thinks the MAGA movement poses a very serious threat to democracy and to freedom in the United States. Now, I think he probably did not do this because there is nothing going on. There was the January 6th insurrection in 2021, and there are signs that this is only ramping up. So we're in the middle of a time where we're seeing what many call fascist developments in the United States. And we're going to talk about fascism and the loss of self in a moment. So dictators such as Hitler can only have the power if the collective group projects the archetype of the God human, onto some kind of redeemer figure, dragging itself and its neighboring nations through idolatry of the state and through max ecstasy to destruction. That is what happened in Nazi Germany. Now, one of the things that I want to clarify here is that the fear that is experienced, like many right now don't feel a lot of fear when they're worshiping a leader. It's not the effect of fear that Drewermann talks about here. In fact, he says that often people that are very aggressive, they're not aware of their fear, but they are actually petrified fear. And so in their kind of being like stone hard, that's where the fear is located. They don't want to show it. But this petrified fear is what he calls an existential project. And here he uses a term by Heidegger, the Entwurf is the German word. And that is a basic attitude. It's a fear that liquidates the individual's freedom and makes them simply a function of the collective. This is the greatest danger when fear is the primary motive for people, because people then are very susceptible to group psychology. And being part of the big mass becomes something that seems to relieve fear. But as Drewermann shows in the analysis of Genesis 3, is that the group actually functions like the fruit on the tree in that story. It functions to calm the fear in many respects by going to the group and believing that one becomes part of some divine destiny, part of basically God. So another thing that I want to, at the outset here, clarify is that there is what Drewermann calls a counter-finality of aim and result. So I've already talked about how a lot of harm is often done in the name of the greatest moral ideals, or people say, you know, God will create a heaven, or do this or that. But what happens is that it is fear that turns this ideal actually into its opposite. We know that phrase that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's basically an example of the counter-finality of aim and result. The good intentions have an underbelly of fear and are turned actually into the opposite. Now let us take a look at the details of this story. Drewermann approaches this story in basically on 4 different levels. And there are 3 volumes here. And the first volume deals with just the text, with understanding the influences of the text. That's called exegesis. So you go into the text and see what comes out of it. You try to dig out the meaning based on the historical context, based on the sociocultural context, based on what we know probably led to the development of the text, its literary form and all of that. Then this is where most exegetes often stop. In more recent years, there have also been an appreciation of understanding more the social cultural dynamics, even the psychological dynamics. And so Drewermann has a second volume on the psychological and psychosocial really meaning of the text. And he doesn't just analyze Genesis 2 and 3, he analyzes it all the way up to the Tower of Babel, which, if you are familiar with art, this fascinated artists throughout the last 2,000 years. And then in the third volume, Drewermann goes to the third and fourth level of interpretation to understand the text. And this is a philosophical interpretation to try to understand what kind of thinking is behind this and what kind of philosophical fears. And then he goes into the theological meaning, what ultimate questions actually are dealt with in that. And so I will go through all 4 of them here briefly, and then we'll get to a last part where Drewermann suggests that this story can also tell us about how we ourselves, each of us, each human being, can learn something from this story and from actually the understanding of how we relate to the ultimate questions, and that there are ways in which this dealing with ultimate questions in a fearful way leads to 4 different particular forms of misrelation to ourselves. So there's a lot here. I'll try to go quickly through this because I want to do all of this basically within the next 20 minutes so that we can close here in a timely fashion. So the big strokes that I want to make here is the big question was, how does in the text the world turn from, Adam and Eve, the characters, and these are characters. These are not real physical people. Jewish religion is based on storytelling. They didn't think of this as historical people walking in a garden and a speaking serpent. That's not what was meant ever with this. This is something that later Christian theologians made out of this, misunderstanding these stories. But so what does the story try to say by portraying basically that the world turns from Adam and Eve, these characters in the Garden of Paradise, where life is good and God is good, turning into life is misery, as this picture by Jacopo Pondormo, which is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And I had a chance to see that image, that painting actually this summer. Turns into that life is misery and God is experienced as adversary. Basically, the way Christian theology has always understood this is that this happened because people wanted to disobey God. But this is not what Drewermann says actually is going on. And so we have to listen carefully to the text. There are a few presuppositions that we have to make. First of all, images of God which do not heal and are against our life are distorted images of God. They distort the reality of God, which we have on some level to assume is love. Otherwise, there is really no use and no reason for believing God. Because all other images God, Drewermann on some level points out, through his psychological and philosophical analysis, are distortions of God or of the God image. The first distortion is what we're seeing here in Genesis 3. In the creation account of Genesis, God creates humans and gives them all the Garden of Eden to till and to keep it. So that is seen as the original image of God. In that image, God is experienced as trustworthy, life-affirming, intimate and close, connected. And it is this God who gives the following instruction, or says the following in Genesis 2:16 to 17. It does not sound to them as a commandment. God says there, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. So here, only one tree is off limits, and it's a mere fact statement. If you eat of it, you shall die. Fast forward to Genesis 3. Enter the serpent. The serpent says that God said this instead. Genesis 1, serpent says, did God really say that do not eat from any of the trees of the garden? Well, if you just heard it, this is not what God said. You can eat from all the trees, but from this one tree, do not eat. And so now more importantly is what the woman character in the story, or the human character, it is not about the woman, it's about the human character. The woman here speaks as a human character. She says, no, you, the serpent says, no, you will not die. Rather, I actually went ahead of myself here. We're still staying with the serpent. No, you will not die. And then the serpent also says, rather God knows that the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So the serpent portrays that all trees are off limits and God is utterly withholding. And the serpent promises to turn humans into God. Now, in response, this is where I was going a little too fast. In response to the serpent's question, humans do not want to disobey. Instead, they want to defend God. And they say, no, God said we can eat from all of the trees in the garden, but from the one tree we shouldn't eat. But then they add a taboo to it. Now, the taboo psychologically already indicates that some fear has crept in. And now, in the fear, God becomes for them also withholding. And it is then that the serpent's voice, and we'll get to what all this means, sounds appealing. Only when God in this moment is lost in a fantasy of fear, when they themselves actually are powerless, only then will God appear as heteronymous. And so it is then when they have lost their ground of being that they experience in Genesis 2, the ultimate affirmation that everything is good. When that sense is lost, then there is a sense we have to now take something in the world and substitute for that. So something in the world substitutes for something that isn't really tangible in the world as an object. And so at that moment, the fruit becomes tempting. But it's not because they didn't want to obey or something like that, because the whole notion of obedience and disobedience only enters after they have become afraid that they wouldn't have a footing, that maybe God was forbidding because of this voice. Now we have to go, of course, into what does the serpent represent? And there, Drewermann goes first into the psychological interpretation. Now, the first distortion leads to them having the knowledge of good and evil. Now, counter to what the knowledge of good and evil has typically been seen as us distinguishing between knowing what is morally right and knowing what is morally not right, this actually has nothing to do with the story. Because in the story, the knowledge that they actually gain is that they were naked and ashamed of themselves. This is the knowledge that they gain according to the story. And this is in contrast to how they experienced nakedness in Genesis 2, because there already they were aware of nakedness. It says it explicitly in Genesis 2:25. It said they were aware that they were naked and they were not ashamed of it. So the difference between Genesis 2, the paradise experience, and Genesis 3, the fear experience, is that now they're naked and they're ashamed of themselves. That is the knowledge of good and evil, to be just human and to feel ashamed of oneself. That's the bad thing. And that is the only thing, according to Drewermann's interpretation, that really the story wants to say God didn't want humans to experience. It was not that God wanted humans not to know what's good and evil in terms of knowing what's right and wrong, but rather that God did not want humans to feel ashamed of themselves, that God did not want humans to feel, oh, I'm vulnerable and that's a bad thing. I'm not perfect. I'm not infinite, right? I'm a limited human being and that's a bad thing. That is the experience that is the knowledge of evil. And then that view of themselves is they're ashamed of themselves, they feel never good enough. And also now it creeps in, now the other who looks at one is seen as the ultimate competitor for the recognition one still will seek from God, or the absolute recognition that one still will seek. And that is the story that then leads into Genesis 4, the Cain and Abel story, where Cain is trying to find some absolute blessing from basically God and feels that Abel is getting all of it and kills Abel because he feels really ashamed of himself. God is then portrayed as distant, as withholding, and so on. That's the origin of a violent God image. And now you already have in Genesis 4 also the origins of war. Nations will say we are ashamed, or a lot of wars are fought because one nation feels that it has been shamed by another, or that it is made to feel it's not sufficient. And then the people will go to restore their honor and their dignity, and so on. Now, the psychological interpretation goes into that this looks at the symbols that are part of the story. That is very important to look at. And in the psychological interpretation, we have basically two primary symbols that need to be looked at. One is the symbol of the serpent, and the other is the symbol of the tree. Now, we don't have a lot of time here, and I recommend that you read this book here. It's in the first chapter. But the quick rundown is that these images are basically images for sexuality, and on one level, and also for a longing for hope. Now, one of the very interesting things is that in psychological research over the last century, we have discovered, and anyone who has seen a child come into the world, we look at whether it has a reflex. And this reflex to hold on to basically the mother, or hold on to the breast to drink, is an evolutionary reflex. And it is something that one psychologist, Leon Santi, called the drive to cling. We have a drive to cling, to hold on to something. And in this story here, basically, there is a drive to cling that comes up in Genesis 3. Psychologists have pointed out that this story, in many respects, seems like almost the process of weaning. Erik Erikson is the one who pointed that out particularly, and of then feeling like when we're teething as babies, then we're going to be thrown out of the paradise. We are not allowed to drink from the land of milk and honey and all of that, if we go into other religious symbolism here. The tree, the symbolism of the tree is so charged because it, in the human evolution, served actually literally as a place of security. If you look and you see squirrels looking for safety, you will see them run up a tree. When humans first stepped out into the steppe, out of the forests, into the open plain, they remembered that they had been running up trees basically for safety. And this psychologically, if we think about evolutionary, or in psychology, we call that phylogenetic memory, this drive to cling is also connected to holding on to the tree and for security. So there are security needs, there are nurture needs, and all of this also gets projected into the sexual area as well. So the fruit is often in art is portrayed as something sexual, and there's often a connection between the so-called oral and the sexual psychological dimension. Now, so these are some psychological dimensions that are going on. Now, Sigmund Freud talked about the guilt feelings that people experience around sexuality. Melanie Klein and others talked about that there's even earlier guilt feelings that we experience just for wanting to eat that often come out in eating disorders. And that all these areas get charged with particular kinds of fears, basically, with particular kinds of anxieties. And so these are some of the fears that are expressed psychologically in this story. What Freud called edible fears, then oral fears, and so on. Now, one of the things that we also have in this story is once they're thrown out of paradise, there are the punishments. Now, what's very interesting is Drewermann argues that these punishments are actually not new things in the world, but they're only turning around things that already existed into a negative thing. So there is, giving birth that's being turned into something negative. There are the punishments are related to paleoanthropological fears, he points out, and I detail that more in my book, Fear of Guilt, Fear of Hunger and Impoverishment, a hypochondriacal fear, fear of segregation and abandonment, and fear of no way out. Now, I want to move to the philosophical interpretation, because the philosophical interpretation basically asks, well, okay, all of this is good and fine, but this story is just a story that maybe some people experience fear, but this story, as religion has claimed, says that all people experience this. How do you make sense of this? The story of the doctrine of original sin basically argues that all people have sinned. Well, how can that be possible? If everyone does it, can that be really guilt, right? So this is one of the things that Drewermann tries to understand. So, but he doesn't really try to understand it so much from the doctrinal point of view, but more from why do we all on some level try to grasp or try to use something finite as if it gives us ultimate meaning, like a job, like a partner that then leaves us, like an organization that we thought would never lay us off. These are just some simple examples. All of us are familiar with investing something finite as if it was something infinite or absolute. And so the big question is, how can that be? And is it inevitable that this happens? And so he goes into the philosophers who have talked about this very story, because this story of Genesis 2 and 3 has been the topic of the main Enlightenment and existential philosophers. So he goes into Immanuel Kant, who basically said, well, there is a way that we can think we are both part of the natural world, our body here, that's causality, but we're also part of the spirit. We have a reason, which is our spirit, and that is free. And so what can happen is that we, on some level, can conceive that, let me go to this here, that something appears to be subject to causality, like our body and necessity, but that it is actually the result of an original free choice, hence guilt. So that basically what he's saying here, Kant helps us understand that we could make a free choice to set something in motion that then would have a causality, and we on some level would feel like we can't interrupt it anymore, right? But what on some level that does not do is that what Kant basically said, this is due because of nature being something that is causal, and so that it basically comes from outside, from our natural condition. Well, then he goes to Hegel, and Hegel didn't seek evil in that it comes from our limitations in many respects of how we interact with nature, but said there's something in our spirit, in our consciousness itself, that leads us into falling out of ourselves. And so Hegel is the one who famously said that spirit is that we become aware of ourselves, then we look at ourselves as if we were someone else. And so when that happens, there is like a gap that's being created. And then we're seeking to overcome that gap. And he thought that we would then find a way to reintegrate what we have denied, and then we come to a new synthesis. So thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But if that is the nature of how fear leads to evil, how the fear of the spirit would lead to evil, then basically, Drewermann argues against Hegel, all evil would just be a necessary evil in the service of expanding consciousness, because for Hegel, all of this is in the service of the human spirit making progress. And so he rejects that. And then he finds Jean-Paul Sartre, who picked up, the French philosopher who picked up Hegel's view, but without that spirit metaphysics. Sartre basically said, well, yes, we become aware of ourselves. And so we are first being in itself, which then becomes being for itself. And the goal would be to become being in itself, for itself. So to also overcome this. But what Sartre says there is that this synthesis is actually not possible because we can never jump over this gap. We can mitigate it, but the lack of being that has come about when we become aware of selves is always there. And so that actually is freedom. When we do that jump of becoming aware of selves, that is freedom. And so Sartre thought it's necessary that we experience, in that freedom, we actually experience anxiety because we leave ourselves in a moment and we become aware of ourselves. And that opens freedom. That also opens possibilities. I can be this now, or I can be that now. I'm not just being in myself one thing. Now, Sartre, and Drewermann goes into this, Sartre thought that this lack of being is then something that also leads to us feeling ashamed through the gaze of the other. And that is the origin of violence as well. And so Sartre developed a social philosophy that tried to, through certain way the group is together, try to overcome it. But Drewermann actually thinks that Sartre on some level is kidding himself in the way he's doing it, because we never really can overcome this. Now, that's the philosophical interpretation. Now, if we go to the symbol, I want to only focus here on the symbol of the serpent. The serpent, in many respects, philosophically, is representing the call for jumping into self-awareness and becoming aware of one's limitedness, of one's finiteness, but in doing so also of one's materiality that limits us, one's finitude, or the philosophical word that's often used, one's contingency. And so philosophy there tries to deal with that. Now, Drewermann says that all of this really doesn't provide a way out of the fear that is created by this. And so the serpent, which is also a mythical symbol for materiality, for rebirth, and for finitude, and so on, is something that's not just in our spirit in this sense, but that actually represents, and this is where the theological interpretation now comes in. The theological interpretation is that the serpent is not just about contingency and nothing in that sense, but it's the principle of non-existence. It's not just an existence that's finite and contingent, but it's a principle that the principle of non-existence versus the principle of existence, and God representing existence and wanting us to exist. So that is the theological dimension of fear: to exist or not to exist, to be or not to be, to say with Shakespeare. That is the question, theologically, actually. And this is not just about our physical being, but about our meaning. This is not about physically existing. It's about to be or not to be, has to do with, am I meaningful or not meaningful? Am I just existing and deluding myself I'm existing? Sometimes there are movies or art forms that wonder, are we dreaming, or are we dreaming that we're dreaming, and so on. The struggle between existence and not existence is an existential one. And so Drewermann, for the theological interpretation, this is the final piece, goes to Søren Kierkegaard. And Søren Kierkegaard basically said that we are becoming aware of our finitude, and that and of our either I exist or I don't exist as if we're staring down into the abyss. And as we're staring down into the abyss, we become dizzy with fear. That's what anxiety is. That's in his famous book, The Concept of Anxiety. And in dizziness, we then try to hold on to all kinds of things. So this notion of dizziness is what helps Drewermann as an idea of not moralizing that we're grasping for straws, basically. We're trying to hold on to anything so that we don't have the feeling of not existing. So it's understandable. It's more like we need therapy. We don't need a jail. We don't need hell. We need trust so that we don't have to identify with something that gives us the promise of making us ultimately existing when it really doesn't, like the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, the brothers Karamazov. So now this dizziness for Kierkegaard creates a misrelation to the self. And the misrelation to the self is a misrelation that takes certain aspects of ourselves, and we are hanging ourselves on this aspect. Kierkegaard speaks of this as polarities in ourself. And Kierkegaard thought that for us to exist, we on some level are relating to an absolute self because we didn't create ourselves. So something created us before we created ourselves. So there is a relation to that original relation that created us, right? And so when we are falling out of that relation, out of that absolute relationship with what created us, then we are getting a misrelation to ourselves. And this misrelation takes different forms. And so I describe in my book that this misrelation can be aligned, Drewermann does this, can be aligned with four major forms of what psychoanalysis has described as neurosis. For instance, in depressive disorder or neurosis, there is a misrelation to the infinite. So one polarity is between we're feeling like as if we're there's infinitude and there is just finitude. The other polarity is between necessity and possibility, and they're on some level related. But for instance, when somebody has hopes of this and that will happen, or for infinite life, or for immortal life, that itself shows there is a dimension of infinity in us, or infinitude. And so we have that pole, and then we have the pole of finitude. And we can, in order to deal with our fear, we can hang ourselves on either. And so when somebody is very depressed, they infinitize guilt feelings of what they need to do for others. When somebody is very schizoid, this is going into schizodynamics, they try to exclude the infinity and say what all of this, what cannot be counted, really, this is very simplistic right now. You have to really go into the book to understand the details of it. But finitude is the pole they hang themselves on. What is knowing, what is known, what can be counted, and so on. Somebody who is obsessive compulsive will hang themselves on the pole of necessity of the self. Only what is needed is important. Somebody who hangs themselves on the histrionic, or what used to be called hysterical pole, hangs themselves on the pole of possibility and doesn't find footing in getting the necessary things to make those possibilities become realized. So the goal, and I want to show you this just very quickly here at the end. And I'm just going to go to the diagram here because I'm working actually to look at how to integrate psychology and spirituality in this manner. And here's the diagram of this over here. So here, and so there's this, and actually there's another version that I can show here that's actually better because, yeah, in the PowerPoint it's better. I'm going to show that right now. PowerPoint has a more comprehensive version of this. So if you look at the PowerPoint here, the association between these different forms of despair and the psychological so-called disorders. Now, there's a lot that needs to be said here because there could easily be the idea that, oh, one needs to have religion in order to be psychologically healthy. That's not at all what Drewermann talks about. That would be a violent God image if one did that. But I want to just point out here what Drewermann argues is in order to really find healthy religion, one needs to basically counter the fears on these different levels with trust. And that is why he argues the way that Jesus encountered people was characterized by a trust that basically helped people to give up the fears that they felt that were put on them in the name of God. If one can reinterpret the stories in the Gospels where Jesus encounters people and these healing stories, and also even the miracle stories, as symbolic stories for the process it takes to work through these fears that were placed into the God image, often the aggressions that were placed into the God image, then we can undo a violent God image, and then we can also stop to perpetrate and to propagate the violence in the name of God in the outside external social world among people, in families, and in nations. So I thank you for listening. Next week, I will not post the video next week, but I'll post one again in 2 weeks. This is part of actually a course I teach at Christian Theological Seminary on spirituality and God images in counseling and culture. But in 2 weeks, I will post a video on how all of this dynamic creates war, misogyny, and what can be done to counter those forms. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to welcoming you next time. And if you want to get ahead and read more, this book is available on Amazon and also at Bloomsbury, my publisher. Thank you so much.